sort of finish up a discussion around vertical integration. And I will also give you like a sample exam question as part of this. So we talked about vertical integration, and we were talking about the benefits of outsourcing. I just want to make sure it's clear the benefits of vertical integration, and then give you a chance to sort of practice the sort of what you know, the framework on a problem. So, reasons for vertical integration. The chapter talks about 3 C's. One is capabilities, the second is coordination, and the third is control. So, if you feel like that you need to build a capability in a particular area to help you be distinctive for one reason or another, then this is an area that you want to invest. We often think about those capabilities as core competencies or core capabilities, but things that you think you need to do well in order to differentiate your product or service, or to create barriers to imitation, those are things that you want to do internally. Now this assumes that you can do it better than anybody else, right? So you've got to figure out whether or not you can perform a certain activity better than anybody else out there in the world, but you really want to be world class. Today with the global economy, you've got to be very good if you're going to be in a particular activity or in a particular business. Second reason that you would want to vertically integrate is to coordinate. This would be coordinating 2 activities where there's a high degree of interdependence, or we would think about it as reciprocal interdependence. As you read about in the chapter on alliances and vertical integration, the greater the interdependence, the more likely you are to want to have both activities conducted inside your firm and have control over it. And then the third reason that you would want to vertically integrate is for control. So by conducting it internally, you now control the prior steps or the next steps, which gives you access to either critical raw materials like Alcoa was able to get when it backward integrated, and it started to buy up large areas of land that were known to be rich in bauxite, with key raw material that is needed to make aluminum. And so now, by backward integrating and by buying it, they knew that they were going to have access to that and have control over that key raw material. Or it could be forward integrating, like Apple did with their Apple stores, which now puts you in direct contact with the customer. You don't have to rely on Best Buy or Walmart or another retailer to make sure your customer gets good service. You now sort of can control the customer experience in a way that you couldn't if you're using other retailers to sell your product or service. Okay, any questions about this? All right. Of course, there are sort of the two dangers of vertical integration. One is this loss of flexibility. So once you are engaged in a particular activity, Schwinn's making bikes in the US, they're not doing it competitively. What do? If you are engaged in production of a product and you aren't world class? What happens if you stay in that activity, and we saw this for years and years in the US automotive industry with GM and Ford. For years and years, they would make a lot of their own components and they just weren't competitive. In contrast, Toyota and Honda were outsourcing those same parts to outside suppliers who were actually really good at that particular activity. Whether it was brakes, which you think, man, maybe shouldn't you make your own brakes? And yet Toyota and Honda were outsourcing to suppliers that their whole focus was braking systems, and that was what they were good at, and they supplied to a wide range of automakers. And it turned out that GM and Ford really couldn't do it as well as some of the outside suppliers. So you've got to be aware that once you're doing it, there's a loss of flexibility, and there's some cost if you need to get out of it. And it also can result in a loss of focus. So we talked about the advantages at Nike being that they could now focus their attention, their resources on just being good at marketing, advertising, shoe design. And they don't have to worry about, they do have to manage the supply chain. They have to make sure they know how to get, good suppliers on board and get their shoes at low cost. But they don't actually have to be involved in being up on the latest techniques of manufacturing, production, producing in the right countries, and so on. Okay. All right. So let's move to, I've got Andrew. Andrew, so here is your mini case.
Awesome.
Awesome. So this would be a potential sample exam question. So you have to decide whether to make or buy a component, a part that's an input for a product that you sell for $49.95. Your analysis shows, based upon the estimate of volume of parts, your variable cost per unit will be 50 cents. Your estimated volumes, your fixed cost is 48 cents per unit. A quick bid in the market suggests you can currently buy the same part from 2 suppliers for $1 or $1. You should choose the best answer given the information above and explain your choice. Make the part and capture the profits. Buy the part on the market. Make some parts and buy some parts to keep leverage over your suppliers, or none of the above. Which do you think would be?
So 50 cents of variable costs and our fixed costs. So we'd be making it 98%.
We'd be making it at 98 cents per unit. We can buy it for $1. We can buy it for $1.01.
I would say buy it from the market, given what you're reading, because it said that most suppliers are tacking on a certain margin, and usually you're able to forego having to do all the coordination and just ask for a 5% decrease to pretty much outbid yourself with another supplier. So I would choose B, buy the part of the market.
Okay. So that one, you guys should know the answer to that. There was a sidebar in the chapter that looked at sort of the classic mistake. This mistake happens all the time. So people will look at it and say, but we can make it for less than we can buy it. That doesn't mean you have a cost advantage. If you can make it for less, you'd better be able to make it for significantly less. So that if you were selling the product, the question is, can you sell that product on the market? Right? So there's this sort of question, are you good enough at an activity that you should actually be thinking that we're so good at this, we could actually sell this product on the market ourselves? Yeah.
Another point that the book brought up was that these other suppliers that you're buying the parts from are experiencing economies of scale because they're actually going to your competitors and also selling similar parts. So you'd be kind of caught in a trap if you reproduce the product yourself, because you're not able to sell your competitors. They're not going to be purchasing parts from you. They're going to be purchasing from other suppliers of parts.
Okay.
So,
now, can you think of any sort of condition under which you would want to make this part? What's that?
If it somehow differentiates you.
Okay, if somehow this product, you want to use it to differentiate your product in the marketplace. So it has to be different in some ways than what you can buy on the marketplace. So if somehow you want to use it as a differentiator, you might want to make it yourself. But if it's not going to really be a differentiator for you in the marketplace, then there's really no reason to buy it. You might as well, or to make it yourself, you might as well buy it on the market. Okay. All right, good. It's interesting, over the years, so when I was a student here at BYU, we had the Cougar Eat. The Cougar Eat was a cafeteria. Food was horrible. And I always wondered, why was BYU in the food business, right? Now, they eventually decided to outsource, right? They went to companies that are in the food business. We haven't done that across the whole campus. You know, we still have the Blue Line Deli here. I don't know whether you think it's great food, but it always sort of strikes me that they might be better off putting Kneaders or another, a company that's sort of in the food business, in that space. It's sort of this is the sort of make-buy decision, right? So it's like, do we really think we're good at food? I've often wondered this with some of the software that we create internally, Learning Suite. It's like, do we really, if we're really that good at writing software, we should be writing that software and selling it to other universities, right? That's how good we need to be in order to be in that business. And this is the way you should think about make versus buy. So anyway, that's sort of the way you should be thinking now about make versus buy when you look at any company, at any sort of activity. You're like, should they really be in that business? Should they be doing that activity, or should they be outsourcing it to somebody else? Now, when you outsource, you could either choose more of an arm's length relationship, where you're buying an input and maybe you're doing it more like bids, like Nike, or you can do it with more of a partnership. And that's what we want to sort of talk about. You have this sort of core competencies that are your sort of core activities that differentiate your product or service, that what you should do better. But then there are some things you might want to surround that with partnerships where you're actually doing some unique things with other companies and working more closely together rather than just sort of buying their inputs, which are the same as what they would provide for anybody else. So let's move now to a discussion of AT&T and Apple, and I have, let's see, I've got Curtis today, and Bridger, and Blake. If you could help us get started on our discussion with Apple. And let's start, Curtis, let's just begin by being very clear about what were the strategic objectives of AT&T at the beginning. What were they trying to achieve, and what were the strategic objectives of Apple at the beginning of the alliance?
Yeah, so AT&T was trying to establish themselves as a real competitor in the wireless industry. They had been a huge player in the traditional landline phones previously, but they've lost a lot of that. So they wanted to become a real prominent player in wireless as well.
Okay, so they're trying to establish their position. In fact, they're trying to establish a premier or leading position in wireless. Okay? So that's one thing that they're trying to do.
And then Apple was wanting to also get into the smartphone business. They had success with the iPod and computers previously, and they wanted to sort of combine those into one product. They saw that smartphones might take away from their content business, so they wouldn't be selling as much on iTunes and stuff. They'd be going through, or their users would be going through these smartphones to get their entertainment, so they wanted to jump into that and make sure that they didn't lose that share in their iPod business.
Okay, so they wanted to enter the smartphone business. It's an area, so what you're suggesting is there's sort of two reasons for wanting to do this. Number one is actually they're trying to protect their music business, because what they could see happening was the shift of people wanting to play their music, not just have a separate iPod device, but they want to have it combined with their phone. And so what they're starting to see is this transition of phones starting to be able to hold music. And so for them, actually, one of the issues here is they're trying to protect their iPod, in effect, their iPod and their music business. So that's one objective, is to protect the music business. And of course, the second is to expand to a new market, to a new product market, which should expand their number of customers, obviously, and be able to grow their revenues. Okay? Bridger, anything else that you think is important to note about what they were trying to achieve with the alliance?
Well, I think Apple also, they said they wanted funding. They wanted to do get some money there, but still be totally in charge of the design of the whole product, and not be in a long-term contract. Just be able to, at the beginning, have an exclusive contract.
Okay. Right. So they want this to be short-term. Help us fund it, help us launch it, and then we don't want you to have it for a longer period of time. Okay. And anything else for AT&T?
I think another thing with them, and Curtis sort of touched on this, is they want their brand to be associated with Apple. They wanted, he said, like, even if we put a paper bag over that has the AT&T symbol, I want people to think AT&T iPhone.
Yeah. So they're trying to, in some ways, they're trying to reconceive or rename or reposition their brand. Because, let's face it, AT&T, I don't know, when you were young, I don't know how much you remember in grade school, but do you remember AT&T? What did AT&T stand for to you? What was it? This phone company?
My grandma's phone company.
My grandma's phone company. Yeah, it was Ma Bell, right? This is my grandma's phone company. I think that's actually the way most young people thought about AT&T is, this is my grandma's phone company. Why would I want to get a phone from my grandma's phone company, right? It's sort of like, Oldsmobile. They retired the Oldsmobile brand. They tried to do some commercials before the end saying, this is not your father's Oldsmobile. but we couldn't be fooled. It was still our father's Oldsmobile. It was an Oldsmobile, you know. If you don't take away the brand, I'm still going to think of it as an Oldsmobile. And this is actually an interesting issue for strategy. And that is that your core competencies, something that you build over time and you're really good at, including a brand, can become what's called your core rigidities. In other words, it can prevent you from doing new things because customers view you and see you in a certain way. Right? So it makes it hard to expand and do different things if your brand stands for something. And you want your brand to stand for something. And the AT&T brand stood for something and was very successful for 75, 80 years. But at some point, people thought of it as old line, my grandma's phone company. This is wireline, those old AT&T phones, that were sort of square box. That's the way people thought about AT&T. So they're trying to reposition the brand. And Randall Stephenson, the CEO, said after they launched the iPhone, he said within a couple of months, he did a trip to India. And he said the only thing people wanted to talk with him about on this trip was the iPhone. And that AT&T was like the exclusive provider of the iPhone. And he said, that's when I knew we'd made a good decision. Is that everybody wanted to associate, they were now starting to associate our brand with Apple. Apple's on a roll. iPhone is this sort of cool new product. And this is going to help us reposition our brand for sort of the next generation. And today, what do you think of now as AT&T's brand today? Still your grandma's phone company? Or it's lost a little bit of that?
What do you think is the most reliable network? And it's debatable, but
that's what they claim it's the most, now you have to make sure you look at how they're measuring the most reliable network. But, because they have to actually have some way to measure it in order to make those claims. So they all sort of pick different ways that they could be the best and measure it a certain way, and then they make sure that they're claiming that they're the best. But at least they're out there saying they're the most reliable network.
I think they're trying to be hip and cool. Like they have this commercial for little kids, right? They're really funny. Everybody loves them. People will like YouTube those commercials and show people because they think they're really funny, right? When they first came out, I was like, oh, this is hilarious. This is great. So I think they're definitely targeting a different demographic. No more grandmas. Let's make it funny and fun for everybody.
So you think they've done a pretty good job of repositioning them?
Oh yeah. I think so.
Okay. Yeah.
I think another one of their main focus was not just that we're a wireless network, but that we're the best wireless network for data. Like, not just for phone calls, but for everything else that you want to do your phone. That's what AT&T.
Okay. And I think the other thing that Apple's looking for was they were actually looking for a partner that would be big enough and could provide the data support. And of course, as it turned out, they didn't have the data support that they needed for those customers. But it's probably true when Randall Stephenson, the CEO, says nobody could have predicted the demand for data, and at least we were in the best position to provide it. But the demand for data so exceeded what they expected, and then they had a lot of problems, or early on in particular, until they had to build a lot of infrastructure. Okay. Which of these two companies had the most bargaining power at the start of the alliance? Apple? So what makes, Brady, what makes Apple, why does Apple have more bargaining power than AT&T? What makes one company have more bargaining power in a partnership relationship than another company?
Well, just what we were talking about, both of them were positioned very differently. At that time, I think Apple was very much at the top, like the iPod and everything, whereas AT&T was kind of emerging from, are we still singular, or are we going in a different direction? And with this new product coming out that was revolutionary, Apple definitely had they could have gone to other companies with it, so they had the cards in their hands in that part.
Okay, yes?
I disagree. I think AT&T had the most bargaining power and they failed to use it effectively.
So what gives So this is the issue then is, what's your framework? What's your theory about what gives one party more bargaining power than another in a particular situation?
I think it depends on objectives and channels to accomplish that. Apple could not have entered the smartphone business without partnering with a carrier. It could not have come up with the infrastructure. Verizon was unwilling to do it, and it was the only other real contender. They wouldn't allow them to control, and that left only AT&T with which to do business. AT&T, they could have changed their image, their brand, in any number of ways. Apple was certainly the most convenient, and paid off well for them, but I think they blew it in the
Okay.
negotiation.
Agree, disagree?
I would take the other side. I would say that look at the number of suppliers, look at the number of buyers. Apple is the only supplier who's going to come out with the iPhone, and they knew the iPhone was going to be a big hit. And so the number of buyers, however, are all of these major networks. And I think specifically, I mean, Verizon wasn't willing to stoop down or to take those kind of horrible negotiations that Apple wanted. But AT&T was in a position where they were, in a way, sort of desperate. They really needed this change, and they knew that Apple was the way to do this. So they saw a little more value than Verizon did. So I think Apple would have the better position just because they were the only supplier.
Okay, so your framework. So this is the issue of, you know, you're using sort of the five forces framework here, and looking at buyers and suppliers, and you're saying Apple has something that's pretty unique with the iPhone, more unique than what other cell phone makers were providing at the time, and they could have gone to Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile. They could have gone to a number of players, or they could have gone to all of them. They could have tried to launch this with everybody, right?
Yeah.
They didn't have to do a partnership. They could have just come out with the iPhone and just sold it through all the carriers. That's the way most phone companies, or most cell phone companies did it, right? They didn't do any sort of a partnership. So you're arguing, you know, there were multiple channels to the customer. They could have gone through all of them. What they were offering was more scarce than what AT&T was offering.
Yeah.
So, Derek, what do you think?
Well, I think, no, I certainly can't argue with the fact that the iPhone is scarce. But looking at the objectives, the end goal, the strategy for each of the players, I don't think the iPhone was the only channel for AT&T to change its brand image. And that's why I don't think they had quite the bargaining power that they're purported to have.
Okay.
I think the $10 off each plan was ridiculous, for example.
That's a lot of money.
Um,
Yeah, to give up $10. So if we look at then to achieve the objectives, let's move to what do they give up? Okay, so what does AT&T give up to achieve these objectives?
They give up $5 to $6 billion
$10 per
Right.
month, right?
per month per customer.
Per customer. And what we know later on is the iPhone users on average, their average revenue per user is about $95 per month. So we're looking at, this turns out to be $120 a year out of the $1,140 that AT&T is making. So 120 out of the 1140. So they're basically getting a little over 10% of the revenues. Okay, what else do they give up? Yeah, first.
Development dollars.
Okay.
To help develop the iPhone.
Yeah, development dollars. We don't know exactly how much. It says millions in development dollars to develop the iPhone, but we don't know for sure. So Apple gets money to build this product from them. They don't have to make a huge investment to build the product. Then when they sell it, they not only make money on the product itself, which looks to be somewhere around what? How much money was Apple making per iPhone?
230 or so?
Yeah, so they're making around they said 225 to maybe 3. So they're making 250 to 300 maybe per iPhone, plus they're getting $120 per user per year from AT&T. Okay, what else does AT&T give up? Anything else they give up in order to? Yes.
So future development, so they were forced into upgrading their infrastructure in a way that they may not have been had they gone with a different.
Yeah, it turns out they had to really increase their investment in infrastructure in order to support.
That may have been a really positive thing at the end of the day, but still it's expensive.
Yeah,
So-
it's expensive. Question, yeah, there's a question as to whether or not, I mean, in some ways you can argue it's a good thing to have to make those investments to accommodate additional customers. But then there's also just this notion of if the average user is using a lot more data, then they're also more expensive, they're more costly. Okay, so let's move to, what does Apple, what do they give up in order to try and achieve these objectives? Curtis?
We have a 5-year exclusive contract. with-
So, short term, so it's 5-year exclusive. I'll just leave it up here, but this means they cannot sell in the United States, at least, iPhone through any other carrier. So they're now, in terms of this 5-year exclusive, they're now dependent on AT&T and their retail network and their structure in order to sell their iPhone and service. Were they 100% dependent on AT&T?
Retail side.
On the retail side, they weren't.
Right.
Yeah, why weren't they?
They had some Apple stores.
Yeah, they have their own stores as well. I think, was it like 250 or something like that? So they are reliant on AT&T, but they aren't exclusively reliant on AT&T because they can sell iPhones and they can sell service through Apple stores. So I think that's important to be aware of as well. Robert?
So when the iPhone launched, you still weren't able to transfer numbers, like your cell phone number to a different carrier. Pretty soon, I think it was like a year or 2 years after that happened. But Apple didn't know that at the time that they were making this alliance. So they were essentially giving up 5 years worth of 60% of the market share. That there were people on Verizon who may want the iPhone but would never be able to get it. That they would have to wait. And so they were, to some degree, they were giving up growth as part of that contract.
Yeah, so there's this question about foregone growth from other carriers, right? They could have launched to Verizon, to Sprint, to everybody at the same time, the way we see, Samsung and Nokia and LG launching their phones to everybody at the same time. They could have done that. So they're actually foregoing some of the growth from other carriers, potentially, of folks that would have switched. By the time they actually signed the agreement, the portability, AT&T actually had been required to port the numbers, and you may recall that they actually sort of botched that a little bit, and that's what led to them being acquired by Singular. So at least by the time they did it, they knew you could port a number. Okay, yeah, Blake.
In a way, Apple was kind of putting their brand on the line as well because they were linking themselves up to AT&T. If AT&T
Right.
couldn't support the iPhone, then it affects them negatively.
Yeah, so they are putting the brand at risk a little bit because they're linking it with AT&T. And if AT&T doesn't deliver, then there's sort of pie on their face. It's like, and actually in the first 1 or 2 years, there were a lot of customers who were like, why did you team up with AT&T? Why did you do this to us? Because they started with AT&T, data demands were so great, AT&T's network couldn't handle it. You've got all these dropped calls, all of these problems with the network. AT&T's coming back and saying, you can't let people download YouTube on their iPhones, or you've got to limit it to 1 minute of YouTube. And they're like, we're not going to do that. And what was their response to negotiations?
We're going to call
Go ahead, tell your executives. They'll take it up with Steve. We'll win. It's like Steve Jobs. He'll win. So go ahead, be upset. We just want you to, you're just going to have to fix it. You're going to have to invest in the network. And so one of the things that you learn is that in these kinds of alliances, things don't always work as expected. And there's often then this sort of occasional butting of heads that happens with the partners, as sometimes you feel like maybe things aren't equitable. So Blake, do you think this alliance was this equitable to both parties? Do you think one party got the better deal?
I feel like I'm kind of in the middle. I feel like both of them had a lot to gain from this. I am a little bit with Derek. I feel like AT&T could have leveraged this a bit more. But at the end of the day, they both got what they were looking for. AT&T wanted to establish itself. And over the 5 years, it substantially grew its subscribers. Apple wanted to enter the smartphone business, and now they're the leader of the smartphone business. So although I would go back and forth on who should have negotiated a bit more, I think AT&T could have gotten a better deal, but at the end of the day, they both probably wanted.
Probably the biggest issue maybe people would question is giving them that $120 per customer per year, because this rolls, right? So, and what is Apple's cost to get this? Right, nothing. So the good news is, they actually, they are able to get this ongoing income stream from subscribers that move to AT&T with absolutely no cost. Now, one of the things that I do think they gave up was AT&T, when they sell iPhones, they would make a percentage on the iPhones. Typically estimated around 10%. So when it was sold through an AT&T store, they did give up a little bit. So there's they said a small slice on the iPhone, and also they said iTunes. We don't know what they got on iTunes, but I'm guessing is AT&T's pitch was a lot of people are going to be using their phones now for music, and they're going to be downloading it from iTunes. We're helping you keep that business or get that business, so we should get a little piece of that. So, they got a little about iPhone on iTunes, and think about 10%, which if the average selling price is around $500 to $600, they're making $50 to $60 per phone. So you might have said, let's see if we can't negotiate a little harder on this. But for the most part, you feel like this was a good alliance. Both firms were better off,
Right.
as a result of doing it. Okay?
AT&T lost a lot, but I feel like they gained a lot in that they became someone that could compete. Like they were going down, they were becoming an unreliable, they were becoming known as a more unreliable network. They were kind of, on the downward sloping curve of their career. And so like the partnership with Apple caused them to invest in their infrastructure, caused them to increase in quality a lot, and it gave them the ability to compete with Verizon and become bigger than Sprint and things like that. If it hadn't been for the iPhone, I don't think they would have been in a position to even be able to compete with Verizon.
So let me ask, how would you calculate or estimate the value that each company got from this alliance? Yeah, Derek and Austin. Actually, let me go to Austin since I've covered me, Derek.
So we did a market value, we did a market cap estimate. So we found that in 2006, 2007, there was a change, 38%, an increase of 38% for Apple, and an increase in 23% for AT&T from 2006 to 2007. So that's a 65% difference of increase. And then we looked over the full 6 years from 2006 to 2012, and the difference is like over 2,000%. I mean, Apple goes from $56 per share, I think, to like $526 per share, and AT&T goes from 182 to 188, I think, is what they ended up being in 2012. So that's what we looked at as a group, and we looked at just the difference there was immense. I mean, it was like a 3% increase for AT&T and a 2,000% increase for Apple. That's how we looked at it.
Okay, so one way to look at it is, to what extent does this seem to influence the market value of each company, right? What we do know is, give me again, what happens to, let's go to 2006, the year before the agreement. Apple's market value is? 56 billion?
No, that's, yeah.
Okay, and by 2012?
It's 494 billion.
Okay, 490 billion. This is why we've been talking about Apple the last few years. Okay, this is a company that went from actually in the late 90s, people thinking they were going to go bankrupt. Literally, before Jobs comes back, people were thinking Apple was dying. because all they had were computers. They had a very low share of the market. And it wasn't clear that they could do anything to really compete with the PC and all of the software that was available on the PC. You know, they had less than 5% share and were basically declining. And so we're looking at Apple like, you know, it's dying. And then this is one of the reasons why Steve Jobs is so revered. He comes back, and this is sort of the interesting thing. So when Steve Jobs gets fired from Apple in '85, he leaves and he starts a new company called Next. Perhaps the most valuable asset at Next is their operating system. And Apple has not invested in a new operating system from basically the time Jobs leaves until they decide to buy Next to get their operating system. So they buy Next in the late 90s, 96, 97, in order to get the operating system. This brings Steve Jobs back in because he is the CEO of Next. And then because he's now brought back in, they now have a chance to compare Jobs with their current CEO, and they decide, yeah, I think we should give Jobs a shot, you know. And then you see this amazing turnaround that happens with the launch of iMac. Sort of first they do some innovative things in computers, but they go, you know, iMac, and then they got iPod and iTunes, and then they come along with iPhone and iPad, and all of that has an unbelievable impact on the market value of this company, propelling it to being the most valuable company in the world. Now, clearly, this is all not attributable to iPhone. And you can't, and then the question is, really, what would their market value have been had they not done the deal with AT&T and instead had just launched it to all carriers? Right? Or perhaps done the deal with somebody else. But that was, they got the best deal they could. So I think really the next best alternative would have been, what if we just had launched it with all the carriers? How would that have worked? And we'll come back and we'll talk about that as well. But clearly, market value increases dramatically. And Austin, what happens with AT&T?
Their stays about the same.
Their stays about the same.
Like 182 billion.
182, and it goes up to like 188.
Yeah.
It does in the first year.
So 230.
After they launch, it jumps to 227. So they get this spike in their market value in 2007, 2008, after they launch the iPhone. So they do get this spike in market value, but they don't maintain it.
It crashes like 150.
Yeah, it doesn't stay up there. So that's one way to look at it. It's hard to sort of tease out how much of that comes from each, you know, from this particular relationship. Any other ideas on how we could, you know, estimate how much Apple gets out of this and how much AT&T gets out of this? And one thing, what's the value of this to Apple? 120. 5 to 6 billion over the 5 years of the contract. So if you look at sort of the ramp up of customers and you're getting that over that time period, there's $5 to $6 billion that they're getting that they would not have gotten had they just launched this to all the carriers, because they wouldn't have gotten any service revenue. Right? So that's pretty clear value that they've gotten from this particular relationship is the service revenues. So you add to that, this now looks like sort of chump change. The development dollars, the millions, let's say that was 100 million. You know, that doesn't seem like that much in the grand scheme of things. So, and I think this is really where AT&T, I think they were feeling a lot of heartburn when they started to realize how much money this was that they were sending to Apple just for doing the deal. But you know, you probably add 100 million for development costs, and then the question is, were there any other benefits? And it's hard to say, but these are sort of clear dollars. 5 to 6 billion, so you're really looking at somewhere in that range is the clear value that comes because of the partnership. And that's not insignificant. What about AT&T? Yeah.
I think a good metric for what AT&T wanted to accomplish was market share as far as establishing a position.
Okay.
You can see that even though the market share did increase a little, it didn't even increase as much as Verizon's during the same period.
Yeah, what's interesting is Verizon actually did better over that time period. In the first year or so, they gained what? 2 or 3% share? 2%. So you could probably argue that first year they grow 2%, and they're able to sort of hold that. They go up to 3%. Sprint seems to be losing mainly to Verizon. They're the big losers during that time period. AT&T grows a little bit, but Verizon actually is the one that's doing the best during that overall time period without the iPhone, which may suggest why they thought they didn't need Apple. That they felt like they had a lot of things in place, they were doing well without the iPhone. But so let's now think about how many subscribers is that 2 to 3%. Let's say in the final year, how many subscribers does that amount to? Yeah, in terms of their total subscribers, and if we took 2 or 3% of their total subscribers, how many subscribers could we perhaps, Jared?
So in that first year, they gained 20 million subscribers, but between 2006 and 2011, 2012, they gained about 40, 45 million subscribers.
Okay, so they're gaining this total number of subscribers, and a certain percentage of those are probably due to, the Apple, the iPhone, and the Apple relationship. So what we don't know, we're not really quite sure what percentage, but let's say we assume they increase their market share by 2 to 3%. Conservatively, if you look at they have like 100 million subscribers, I think 103 million subscribers in the last year. You could say maybe 2 to 3 million, you'd say 2 to 3 million of those wouldn't be ours if we didn't do the Apple relationship. And it could be even quite a bit more than that if you were to dig into the numbers, but you could probably at least say 2 to 3%, given that they increased market share by 2 to 3%. So if that's right, 2 to 3% represents 2 to 3 million subscribers. What's the value of 2 to 3 million subscribers? To AT&T. How would you get at the value? What they're worth?
Can you look at it by service revenues?
Okay.
So that the average iPhone user was about, or the average service revenue per month for iPhone user was about $100.
Right? 95?
Yeah.
So 1140 per year?
Times 2 to 3 million.
Okay, so we know you're getting 1140 per year. You have to subtract from that
120.
the 120. So you're at 1020 per subscriber. And then I guess the other thing you probably also have to add in is they are making 10% on the phones. For each phone.
Would you also factor in the amount of investment in infrastructure they have to do because of the iPhone?
That you'd want to be able to figure out what is the additional cost to service those particular customers. But let's just start with the revenue side. So, okay, so that makes sense. You got 1140, you subtract the 120, you're at 1020. And let's add what you're making per phone, which was what, $50 to $60 per phone? We're making about 10%. So roughly, let's just, that would be plus, let's say 60 is about 1080. Let's just make that roughly $1,100 per year per user. So what's the annual value?
It's a little, well, between 2 and 2 billion, right?
Yeah, so it's, I think, so 1,100 times 2 million is 2.1 billion or something like that. 2.2 billion. So it's maybe $2 to $3 billion is what you could estimate is the additional revenues that they're generating because they have these additional subscribers that they probably wouldn't have had without the AT&T relationship.
I think also, looking at kind of the time value of money, AT&T gets that money, gets that stream of income forever, provided that they keep the customer.
Okay.
Apple doesn't get their stream of service revenue.
Yeah,
after
this
5 years.
this actually ends at the end of the 5 years, right? So today, AT&T, they got those subscribers, but now they actually don't have to pay this anymore. So they had to pay it to get the customers, but now they don't have to pay that to Apple anymore. So Apple has lost that. So, okay, time value of money, Andrew, give me your estimate of the value of those 2 to 3 million subscribers.
So I'd say if you look at it, just kind of a quick and dirty way of doing perpetuity. You have like an 8% rate of return, which maybe large or small, that'd be about, sorry, my mind's drew a blank. It'd be 1,000 divided by 0.08. 12,500
12,500 per
per customer.
customer
Over the life of that customer.
over the life of that
Assuming
customer.
Assuming that we keep that customer forever,
Okay.
it'd be about 12,000. You multiply that by 2, 3 million. You get, I mean, it's considerable.
So what's 12 to
even-
what is that number? Just so we know. 30 billion? 20, 30 billion? So if that's right, and it's sort of saying, we expect we expect if we can hold these customers for 15 years, you sort of take that $1,200 and that's sort of dividing by roughly that 0.08. After 15 years, the value of the, it's not worth that much once you bring it back to present value. But that's a reasonable way to perhaps look at what would be the value of the customer, assuming we keep them for the next 15 years. And you bring that back to present value, and it's probably maybe around 10,000, 11, 12,000. So now you're looking at $22 to $24 billion. Yeah, Derek.
Not to get terribly nitty gritty, but I do think it is worth remembering that even if Apple had launched with everyone, they still would have gotten 40% of the new iPhone users. They still would have gotten more than $1 billion. More than 1 billion new subscribers because of the iPhone. Presumably.
They would have probably gotten their share of them, right?
Right.
At least. They just wouldn't have had the exclusive share where people were moving to AT&T.
Right.
So this actually leads to my last question here, related to Apple. So AT&T maybe, getting those new subscribers and keeping them, that may be more valuable than maybe we would have given credit for when they did the alliance. So it looks like, given 120, that looks like a lot. And yet, when you're comparing it to being able to keep these customers for a long period of time, it's not nearly as much as, maybe that was worth giving up in order to do this deal if you could pull that many new subscribers. So, last question I want to ask you is, was Apple really better off with a partnership here versus just launching into all carriers? The reason I ask this question is I know many people, like myself, who were locked into contracts. I had T-Mobile. iPhone comes out, and I can't switch. I'm in a contract anyway. And so I stay with my carrier. And a lot of people stay with their carrier. Well, what happens over the next 3 or 4 years? Android comes out, and it gets better to where at the point in the last 2 years, 3 years, since people have had the opportunity to switch, I know many people, now that they've tried Android and the Samsung was like, the phone's good enough, people don't switch. It's like, Android's good enough, so I'm not going to switch to the iPhone. Is it possible that Apple is actually far worse off today because they did the AT&T alliance? Rather than launching everywhere and trying to get as much penetration as possible, early on when they had a differentiation advantage, growing their, basically growing the number of iPhone users before the competition had a chance to respond. What do you think?
I think there's a possibility that the reason they even did this with AT&T was because it might have been a safety move in a way, because they were unaware of how much data would actually be used. And if it was out and every single carrier had the iPhone, it could have made the iPhone look like a really bad product.
The iPhone goes out and everybody has problems with the iPhone because every carrier has a hard time meeting the data demands of iPhone users.
Yeah.
So one possibility is that it could have made the iPhone look bad. It kind of did anyway with AT&T, but it might have been
even worse.
It might have been more broadly spread. Okay, that's a possibility.
Well, this was on that same point that it gave leverage power to for Apple to pressure AT&T to better their network, like you said. Whereas if it was all four, it would have been hard for Apple to go to Verizon, then Sprint, then T-Mobile, and then AT&T saying, "Oh, you guys need to have a better 3G network." Whereas when it was just AT&T, they had the leverage power to go to AT&T.
To say you got to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that the alliance does is it gives them a partner that they have some power over to make sure that they're trying to provide the service that they wanted their customers to get and the data network. And they went to the they partnered with the company that had the best network for data at the time. So it's possible that this might have been one good reason to do the alliance. Karen?
One other thing, with the launch of the iPhone, Apple was entering an adjacent market it had not been a part of before. And with this alliance, it essentially negated any risk it was going to take by going into this market, except for, well, its brand. But, I mean, development costs were paid for. They didn't have to develop a network or a sales network in order to distribute it. Apple is basically able to say, we're awesome, you should pay us so that we can try out a new market. And they were able to do it successfully with AT&T.
This is a very low-risk way to enter a market. I mean, they actually put out nothing. It's sort of like the Disney deal with Oriental Land Company, right? They're basically putting out no dollars, just our know-how,
Right.
and we're getting paid for that.
And you can look back and say, well, there's like X, Y, and Z output done to make more money or could have done it. But looking, and I'm not Steve Jobs and I wasn't sitting next to him during this decision, but thinking about, okay, new market, we've not done it before, we've had experience entering into like the iPod market in the past. Is this going to work? Smartphones are starting to become popular. Let's try it out. What's the way we can do it with the least risk and gain the most success? And Apple went from lower sales and lower market revenue than AT&T to much higher sales and profit and market value.
With very little risk. And so whenever you see one of these deals and it's really successful, it is easy to look at it, like with Disney and Oriental Land Company, and say, oh, Disney should have gone for more. But at the time, you didn't know if it was going to work. There is risk involved. And, Apple did launch the Newton, after all, right? And the Newton didn't take off. So it's not like they've had, not like they've always been successful with their new products. They expected it to be successful, but they couldn't know for sure.
I was just wondering how much of that capital investment was a deterrent for Apple? Like, how much, because it seemed like from the reading that Apple didn't really have the money to develop. That's why they needed AT&T, and that's why there was so much back and forth between them that like they were trying to pressure AT&T to give them monies, but they really wanted to keep that, I don't know,
I
their ability to design.
I suspect Apple would have paid a lot of money to launch the iPhone because of how much they were generating from iTunes and iPods. They wanted to protect that business. I do think they wanted to position it like you should pay for it. I mean, this is your bargaining position, and I think they were in a pretty strong bargaining position because it looked like they had technology that was really, unique to launch in the marketplace. But I suspect they would have put the money in if AT&T would not have come to the table, they would have put the money in. That's my view on it. It's an interesting situation as you look at this. It's hard to know. Clearly, they did it in a lower risk way by launching it through this alliance. You could look at this amount of money and say, well, how many iPhones would we have had to sell through other carriers? What would our increased market share have been in order to make that up, right? Because this was pretty easy money. You would have definitely had to sell a lot more iPhones during that 4 to 5 year time period. You could do that calculation and estimate, that they're making maybe $225 per phone, and so how many iPhones they would have to sell. They'd have to sell quite a few iPhones. But I think at the end of the day, you do get the sense that this was a way that the two companies could collaborate and try and grow the pie for both parties. And that's what alliances are all about, is you're trying to find a situation where two parties bring complementary resources. So when you think about strategy, and we go through the markets, what's our unique value, and then it's the how we deliver, the resources and capabilities we need to deliver unique value. This is where alliances tend to get really exciting for firms, is that we don't have all of the resources and capabilities internally to maybe deliver a certain value that we want to deliver. What other companies can we go to and team up with and collaborate with in a unique way to be able to deliver that unique value better than anybody else? So alliances tend to be really valuable on the resources and capabilities that you need to deliver unique value. So let's just quickly let's talk about alliances for a moment. So I actually I wrote a book called Collaborative Advantage about alliances. This was sort of the early part of my career. Most of my research and what I'm most well known for in the academic community for first 10 years of my career was around strategic alliances and work I'd done around how firms collaborate to create competitive advantage. And wrote a book called Collaborative Advantage. And here's sort of the basic idea illustrated in this cartoon. They're about ready to have a medieval pickup battle with their swords, and the one says to, to his team, "This is dumb, really dumb. Why do we have to go skins?" So for those of you who know about shirts and skins and basketball and other games, this is you have to divide up teams, and you're on a team. And maybe in a medieval pickup battle, you don't want to take that armor off when you're engaged in your pickup competition. But the point is, what we're seeing more and more is that companies, in order to deliver unique value better than somebody else, are finding they have to team up with other companies. And then that often leads to other companies teaming up. You've heard this term ecosystem. You get companies, you get groups of companies that are teaming up together to compete against other teams of companies. And we're seeing that happen more and more in strategic alliances. Now, in the chapter, it talked about 3 different types of strategic alliances. And this is related to how you make sure that the parties collaborate and cooperate. On the one hand, it could be just contracts. You write a contract. This is where you've got the least amount of interdependence, pooled interdependence. Does anybody remember what kind of a sports team competes using pooled interdependence? Golf. Golf teams, each player goes out and shoots their round. You add up the scores, that's the total. And if you could have the best score of anybody on any of the teams, but your team could lose because it's pooled together. Then you move to a higher degree of interdependence, and this just goes from low to high. You could have equity alliances with any of these types of interdependence, but the next is sequential interdependence. What kind of sports team is described as having more sequential interdependence?
Baseball.
Yeah, more baseball. Relay throws. I follow another batter. If he gets on, that changes what, maybe the way I will bat. Sometimes you're going to do hit and run. Sometimes you may bunt. You're going to do things differently because it depends on what the person, the player has done perhaps before you. More so in baseball. And then finally, as you move to more reciprocal interdependence, this is more basketball, right? Because the players are always constantly moving, and what I do depends on what you do, and so there's this, over time, what we find in basketball is teams usually don't get good at basketball until they play together for a while. And I think it was interesting that you had the U.S. team with all of these fabulous individual players, who I remember it was such a shock. We actually lost the World Championships, right? And we lost it twice. And everybody's saying, "What is going on? We're losing to Argentina? How is that possible?" And then they started to select the team more based upon chemistry and requiring at least a 3-year commitment so that the players could get better at learning to play together, because they realized this is a team sport with a lot of reciprocal interdependence. So, you'll write contracts for the most simplest for the more simple alliances, and you'll create equity for more complex ones where there may be shared equity, and create a completely separate company, joint venture, for those where you have the most complex interdependencies.
So the Oregon Alliance and Disney, would that have been an equity alliance?
Yes. Yeah, in a sense, to the extent that that Disney had some equity in the piece, in that it would be an equity alliance. They didn't create a separate company, but they owned a piece of equity, and then they also got licensing fees, which really would be more in contrast. And what would the AT&T Apple alliance, where would that fit? Contractual. It was a contractual alliance. It was pretty clear what each party was supposed to do, right? It's not like they had to work jointly to develop the phone. It wasn't like this joint development of the phone. This is different than IM Flash. IM Flash is a joint venture where Intel and Micron bring all of their knowledge together, our R&D resources, in their cash to create a separate company that's going to make memory. And that's what they're going to be good at. And so that way Intel can stay focused on microprocessors. And it allows each of the parent companies to stay focused on different markets, and then they create a separate company that they both jointly own. That's the joint venture. All right, and I've just put this in here to give you a little bit more detail of what we sometimes see from these kinds of arrangements. So on the one hand, you have sort of traditional contracts, arm's length, buy-sell agreements, licensing, cross-licensing, very, very straightforward. So for many companies, if they're buying office supplies, if you're buying pencils and paper, you don't need to have a partnership. You probably don't need a partnership with your supplier of those. It's not like they're unique to you. You just have a simple buy-sell agreement. And then you're going to have more non-traditional contracts where you're doing more maybe joint research or franchising, product development, long-term sourcing agreements. These things you're going to use more non-traditional contracts. They're longer term in nature. Like the Apple AT&T agreement was a fairly complex contract that they had to write. You might do equity swaps, minority equity investments. So you own a small piece of it, like Disney would own a small piece in Tokyo Disneyland, or equity swaps, or you could create a separate joint venture, but it's not a subsidiary of the corporation. You actually can have wholly owned subsidiaries. So think back to Coke and Pepsi and their bottlers. There was a time at which they were actually subsidiaries of Coke and Pepsi, and they owned the majority of them. Then eventually they actually spun them out, and so now they are joint. They're not a joint venture, but they're not a subsidiary. They have an equity arrangement in them. And then, of course, you could also have mergers and acquisitions where you actually acquire the firm. So one way is to do an alliance to access the resources. The other is do an acquisition. One of the things we've seen is we've seen a dramatic increase in alliances over the last 25 years. More and more revenues are coming through alliances because companies are realizing I'm better off if we team up. Two heads are better than one in order to attack a particular market. So the key is creating value by expanding the pie. And you think about a typical supplier-buyer relationship. You negotiate a contract. Every dollar I can get it up, the price up is a dollar in my pocket and then not a dollar in your pocket, right? It's a zero-sum game. There's like a fixed pie, and you have certain value to the customer, and you split this some way. But it's really all about bargaining and seeing who gets the most of the pie. The partnership approach is designed to actually say, let's not focus on the fixed pie. Let's think about how can we expand the pie together so that we're both better off. Right? And so you can get into these arguments about whether AT&T was better off or whether Apple was better off. But at the end of the day, it may be that they were both better off than if they had gone alone. It's just sometimes one partner ends up better off than another partner because of the way they negotiated the agreement or the bargaining power they had coming into the agreement. So how do you identify strategic partners? When you're outsourcing, when do you want to partner versus more of an arm's length relationship, as we saw with Nike and their shoes? And the fact is, the more coordination that's required, the more it makes sense to partner. So the more coordination that you need to have happen between these two companies in order to make it so, the more you move to more sequential and reciprocal interdependence, the more likely a partnership will make sense. But if I could just buy your input and plug it into my product. So you think about auto companies. You're buying brakes. Do you think brakes require quite a bit of coordination? Compare, what about brakes versus a battery? Brakes a lot more than a battery. Usually you buy that battery and you just plug it in, right? They're sort of standard sizes. So whenever you're doing something that's more complex, you're more likely to need a partnership. And then when outsourcing a strategic component, that's when you typically want an alliance, and that's a strategic. What does that mean? Well, they tend to be inputs or activities that can differentiate your product or differentiate your service. This was certainly true for Apple, or for AT&T with the iPhone. Inputs or activities that influence your brand and reputation. Certainly that was true with the iPhone with AT&T. High value inputs, or inputs that comprise a high percentage of your total costs, or inputs that demand a lot of coordination to achieve the desired performance. So those are the kinds of situations where you might want to think about having an alliance. And even if you have competitors, let's say you have two competitors, Toyota and BMW, they decide to team up on battery technology. It's, let's not think of this as a zero-sum game. How can we expand the pie so that we're both better at battery technology and we take share against Mercedes and Ford, right? So this is the notion, even competitors can collaborate to expand the pie for them relative to their competitor set. So I'm not going to spend really much time on this. We know, you know already about the different ways that you create value in an alliance from the chapter. You just want to be aware of the different ways that you create value. And let me just sort of conclude by sharing that there is this important notion around trust in strategic alliances. Because a lot of people say alliances, because of the interdependence, you need a certain amount of trust. And you can build that in different ways. Here we have the boss of Dilbert's company. He pulls in Dogbert's Touchy-Feely Institute to teach us about teamwork. So he says, I've hired the Dogbert Touchy-Feely Institute to teach us about teamwork. And Dogbert comes in and he says, okay, we'll start with an exercise about trust. I want each of you to sign blank checks and give them to me. What will this teach us about trust, says Dilbert. And he says, it will teach you that trust is an excellent quality for other people to have. Okay, so there is a paradox of trust. The paradox of trust is that when you make yourself vulnerable and you trust another party, that is actually when they can take advantage of you. So alliances are fraught with risk. Even though they look really good on paper because two heads are better than one, you just have to realize that a lot of times things don't work out as planned because of the issue of the trust and the equity in the alliance. Okay, final, so midterm exam, next Monday, sample exam question. Let you read through that. So some of you, the beads of sweat. Okay, obviously this is not going to be the midterm exam question. Okay, I'm just letting you know it could be worse than what I was giving. Okay. You saw the earlier question I had about the part, the question I gave to Andrew. That's an example of a sample exam question. Here's one around a company. Now, I would not review, don't spend a lot of time on the cases. If you've been to class and gone through the PowerPoint slides on the cases and know the high level facts, don't review the cases. If I ask something about a case, it will only be very high level. Like, basically, what was Southwest, what was the key to their cost advantage? Turnaround. And what was it? Fast turnarounds, right? They had all these activities that got fast turnarounds. And then why was it hard for competitors to imitate? Yeah, all of these, they did point to point, but they also, we talked about all of these different activities fit together. You had to do all of them, less congested airports, no mills, you have to do all of those. And then also they had first mover advantages in some of those airports. Okay, we did this one. Yes, I will, I'll post these on Learning Suite. So here's the last one. We didn't spend as much time on this in this particular class, but it would be just basically, what's your framework for looking for growth options? And we talked about growth, so it'd be, how would you think about looking for growth options? All right? So bring your laptops. You can type your exams. So bring your laptops, and I will send out an email with any other details around the exam.
So is it multiple choice or essay?
No, it's all short essay.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be all short essay like this.